came to the fathers quite late.
Oh, okay.
A lot of my own formation was such malformation. I think that the advantage of it for me has been that as somebody involved in trying to teach the faith, I kind of can be very aware of the gaps, the lack of foundations people might have, because I was aware I went through a system of apparently giving me lots of foundations, but in fact it missed out everything now I would have thought was important.
Interesting. Okay.
So, for example, and I don't want to just hog it because I'd love to hear whether you've had the same experience, but so, for example, when I went to study theology, I studied at King's College in London. That was, at the time, one of the most respected places to study a kind of a very credible academic theology.
Okay.
And yet, when we studied, for example, we read almost none of the fathers. The way we studied the Bible was historical critical methodology only. No introduction to any other kind of 2,000-year tradition of how you study the Bible.
Yeah, you just take it for granted that the historical critical is the way to go. Yeah.
No sense of how would the rabbinic tradition have studied it. It's suddenly you just get the German 18th, 19th century.
Absolutely.
That's the way of doing it.
That's exactly how my experience was, yeah.
And then we studied philosophy for theology, but we wouldn't read anything before Descartes. So you're starting in the 17th century.
That's so new, yeah.
Yeah, which is so you get no Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Augustine. You get no development of the whole patristic theology and philosophy. None of the Middle Ages. So it's almost as though you just study the moderns all the time.
Right.
And it's what C.S. Lewis called chronological snobbery.
Absolutely.
If it's later, it's better. It's as though
we clearly know better than they did.
We always did.
Yeah.
I was very struck that I could never have held my own with Plato or Socrates.
Oh, absolutely.
I could never, in a conversation, I wouldn't know where to go.
Absolutely.
So I had to learn all of this after, and I had to do a lot of reading myself into the tradition. No, that's only to say we lack a lot of foundations. And I think the way, in particular, this may be how a lot of people, again, who are more educated in the Catholic faith, who we're speaking to today, they may have received the same kind of fairly desiccated and in some ways quite an arid formation, which is not really fully rounded, patristic, grounded in good doctrine, so on. I know the priest who ran the institute in England said that at the end of his seminary formation there was something called the book burning ceremony, and the priests, the seminarians who were graduating, used to burn their books.
Really? Because
it had been so they were very desirous of getting into pastoral ministry, into teaching, into proclamation. They'd been driven by a love for God's word and wanting to proclaim it. But what they'd received at the time, and I don't think the seminary is like this now. Sure. So I'm speaking about its past. Okay. But it is. It was when he was there. There was a whole sense that what they had received was not able to be fruitfully communicated in a life-giving way to anybody, and it hadn't fed them spiritually.
Okay.
And I know when I first came across the Catechism, which is a book which has really transformed my life, I expected to be reading a kind of reference manual.
Yeah, that's what you would expect. Yeah, that's what I thought too, yeah.
Yeah, and then I opened it up and I read it, and I realized, first of all, that I didn't really understand it. I'd done theology degrees, I'd already got a doctorate, and I still didn't really understand where this was coming from. And yet it was claiming to be the universal common doctrine of the church. So somehow I'd missed that. And my theology had been not predicated upon that, expanding it, developing it, and so on. It had been isolated from that. And I realized, I'd lacked the foundations. So I needed now to rebuild.
Yeah.
And the rebuilding I found the most spiritually enervating and, developmentally fruitful thing that I could have imagined. And I found later on, Ratzinger says, when he's introducing the compendium, the little mini version of the Catechism, he says, the Catechism will always be the place we go to for its spiritual depth. and for its wisdom. And that's what I found there. I didn't find a reference book. I found almost like a spiritual treatise that wanted to say, you'll learn the Catholic faith if you live it deeply in prayer, knowing what you're receiving by way of sacramental grace and the liturgy, you know, and realizing you belong to the mystery of Christ who is alive in his body. It was a different spirituality of the body, which I hadn't come across. Richly patristic and liturgical. Yeah. So, you know, it was a beautiful experience, but I felt my mind was being converted to Catholicism was for the first time as I read that.